Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to what is the first of two New START panels that will be held here at this conference. The next one is tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, so if you have a question that you don't get in today, you can show up tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock and ask it. But thanks for coming, and we hope that you will find that this panel provides some food for thought, for stimulating thought, on the New START Treaty. Before we get into the discussion itself, I just want to go over some thoughts about the role of arms control in today's world. The fact that arms control has to be grounded on realistic assessments and expectations and objectives, I think, is a given for both the United States and Russia, which both have been at this for quite some time. Both countries recognize that there are existing flashpoints, potential flashpoints, around their borders, their peripheries, and their interests, but they also both recognize the political primacy over their militaries and seek cooperation on common interests. But while the differences between our political systems can be a cause for military competition, we both recognize the value of arms control. And arms control has some potential outcomes that we each seek. Arms control may provide assurances to each side about our intentions that drive our modernization efforts. Arms control can also lend predictability to the future of bilateral relationships, and it can serve a benefit to both us and Russia, and just as importantly, to our allies and to our friends. And for those who sat in the previous panel about Korea and extended deterrence, you could see how that would factor into the U.S.-South Korean relationship. And then finally, arms control can serve as a tool to help strengthen the NPT. But it's essential to remember that arms control progress is not synonymous with arms reduction. Numbers are not the main point. We do talk about numbers, but that's only after a very rigorous examination of the process and what we're trying to achieve. The main point of arms control is to provide stability, security, verification, and compliance. Those are the four things that matter. And so with those thoughts in mind, I'll just quickly review the New START Treaty, and I owe a special gratitude of debt to Amy Wolf sitting there in the audience, who knows this like the back of her hand. But in a thumbnail sketch, over the 10 years after the treaty entered into force, it limits each side to no more than 800 deployed and non-deployed ICBM and SLBM launchers, and deployed and non-deployed heavy bombers equipped to carry nuclear armaments. And within that total, each side can retain no more than 700 deployed ICBMs, deployed SLBMs, and deployed heavy bombers equipped to carry nuclear armaments. The treaty also limits each side to no more than 1,550 warheads, and deployed warheads, and of which those are the actual number of warheads on deployed ICBMs and SLBMs, and one warhead for each deployed heavy bomber. The New START Treaty also contains detailed definitions and counting rules that will help the parties calculate the number of warheads that count under the treaty limits. It also has a monitoring and verification regime that is less costly and complex than it was under the START Treaty. The New START Treaty does not limit current or planned U.S. or planned or current U.S. missile defense programs, though that may be a particular point of discussion. And there is the perspective that the New START Treaty provides for strategic stability and enhances the national security interests of each country. With those thoughts in mind, there are some aspects of the New START Treaty that I hope our panel will take on, and I will just quickly run through them. We have this issue of strategic stability, and how does the treaty actually weaken it, or does it enhance it? It addresses force structure, a particular point that has to be examined. It addresses some of the command and control issues. But we also remember what President Reagan had to say about arms control and trust but verify. And with that thought in mind, are the treaty's monitoring and verification measures adequate to meet each party's expectations? And then the issue of ballistic missile defense. How does the treaty impact plans to build effective BMDs? And then it goes on, what impact does the treaty have on the modernization or upgrading plans of Russia and the United States? There are some who contend that the treaty prohibits the United States from doing what some members of Congress and others think is necessary to provide for the national defense. Does it provide a useful step towards future arms control efforts, especially when we begin to look at the issue of non-strategic nuclear weapons? How does the treaty help improve efforts to halt proliferation? And then finally, how do non-declared nuclear powers view the arms control process and the results achieved by declared powers? To discuss these points, we are honored to have a panel of 3 distinguished experts. Leonid Ryabkin from Russia, a former Air Force officer, an academic, an instructor, a scientist, and an arms control expert. He has extensive experience in the political, military, security aspects of policy, and he is currently the Executive Secretary of the Committee of Scientists for Global Security and Arms Control. Next to him, we have Elbridge Colby, a former policy advisor to the Secretary of Defense's representative to the New START negotiations process. He served in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and also served in Iraq. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and is now a research analyst for CNA in Washington, D.C. And then at the far end, we have retired Brigadier General Firoz Khan of the Pakistani Army, a recognized expert on Pakistan's nuclear programs, and now with the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. So, with those words out of the way, Leonid, I'd like to turn it over to you for your thoughts about New START, Russia's expectations and objectives. And anything else you'd like to add? Yeah, it's on. Just pull that down.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul, for this good introduction describing what it means, New START Treaty. And I would like to add that from the Russian perspective and point of view, that for Russia, the New START Treaty, it was great achievement for the more than decade of stagnation in the arms control as a whole process, and also in our strategic relation with the United States. Because, as we all know, that during the George Bush Jr. administration, it was great shift in the whole process of arms control. I cannot say that we just all forgot about the arms control, but it turned to some strange manner that really we cannot understand what's going on. Just some words were that we need arms control, but in maybe it's more important the political will or the leaders of the great powers or any states. Just it's more important than they have formal arms control, and but unfortunately the time shows that political proclamation or appeals sometimes doesn't work. They don't work, but it's important, of course, that political will support arms control, but because still we have in our relations between many countries, we have a great portion of distrust, even between Russia and the United States after decades of arms control talks and negotiations, after the START 1 agreement with many other agreements and bilateral, multilateral, but still we not achieved a big trust between our two countries and between the other countries and our countries. So still it's not maybe a time when just political declaration and political wills just simply work. We must have some mechanism and structure for implementation of many arms control measures, agreements, and any documents which in Russian view must be legally binding, and because of what it means, just political will, even this leadership changing in the country, so that it can lead to the change of the just a drastic change in the policy. So still arms control needs a good agreement, treaties, and mechanism for implementation. That's why Russia, I mean Russian leadership, military and political leadership, was happy with that finally we conclude and then ratified this agreement. Of course, our expectation, Russian expectation, were based on the tradition which we followed for the decades of arms control talks and negotiations with the United States and other countries. Of course, we would like to use the basis which were worked out during START 1 negotiation and START 1 implementation for the term of its existence. So, and our leadership were happy that new administration, U.S. administration, agreed to speed up the process of new agreement, because the Moscow Treaty was mostly political declaration. Of course, it was also the good step, but it was enough from our point of view. And of course, we understand that for such short period of time, it was very difficult to elaborate some full-size treaty, and but the pressure from the both presidents, which was very heavy. That I talked with our people from the foreign ministry. We had my colleague who is sitting here, Vladimir Ivanov, also, that we participated in some consultation with our foreign ministry what to do. And I remember one of the first steps, we just started to discuss with the foreign office people that how to start, what to do, because unfortunately for the more than decades of absence of such talks between the US and Russia, our diplomats, diplomatic office lost the experienced people who can just understand the full scope of the problem, how to discuss it, how to construct it. And the same, we feel that that's the same as I talk with my colleagues from the United States. The same situation was in the Department of State and the Department of Defense in the United States, because those people who worked on this first treaty, some of them gone, some of them are just very old, but still, for us, we use their experience just to help our delegation to talk and to work with American delegation. And we understood very clear that it will be impossible to make for such short period of time at a full-scale agreement. So that I remember that I said that, guys, it's just only one way you can make something like a frame agreement. The answer was that, yes, we understood this. So that some critical and very important issues stayed beyond this treaty. And we understood very clear that the situation, political situation, internal political situation in the United States quite difficult for such agreement, and that I was even surprised, and I think that we are lucky that the Russian position from our Russian leadership was quite soft. We did not insist on some, for example, that's very simply, I think that's demonstrated what was the atmosphere for the negotiation. We knew that the issue of ballistic missile defense will be the critical. But we understood what is the situation of ballistic missile defense issue in the United States. And our policy, even in mass media, was quite carefully we discussed these issues. Inside expert community, we understood that the next the problem for the will be the implementation of the New START treaty. That's why we and our colleagues, some of our colleagues in the United States, understood this very clear. Walt Slocum, we worked with him just maybe for the last 2 years, discussing all this problem, and Secretary Perry just participated in our this private talks, what we shall do, how we can help for implementation of this New START agreement. These additional requirements which provided by U.S. Congress and Russian Duma for implementation of New START treaty just reflected very clear that it's not an easy way for implementation. That's why we are expert community just thinking that we must make our best to provide such recommendation for our leadership, how to ease the way for the New START treaty implementation, and the more important for the follow-up process. And it's good that you are also just put on the agenda of our this two session such important question about how to invite the other declared and non-declared nuclear power to this process, because among all the internal difficulties in New START. But we must also think about the future of the whole START process. And this is future. There will be no future for this further START process without other nuclear states, because in numbers we will be to proceed further with reduction of strategic nuclear arms. So we must compare the total potential of the other nuclear states, because if we will come lower than, for example, 1,000 warheads, so we can see that the total potential for UK, for example, and France and the United States, because we in Russia, we understand that if the France saying that they have the independent nuclear forces, but we understand that they in NATO also, in this case, that it's we must calculate the total potential, for example, and other states. I mean, India, Pakistan, China. China is a very important issue. We think that will be no problem with France and UK to join this process, but for the Chinese friends, it's new for them to be a part of the arms control process. They just only started this. For the India, for the Pakistan, and we also Israel. So that's a huge variety of the problems outside our bilateral relations, and we also must pay the great attention how to work with these states. And it's good that you're invited.
Well, Leonid, on that point, I want to back up a bit here.
Well, that's enough.
You had indicated that there was a loss of experience within the Russian government in the negotiating world. And do you see that as something that will continue to be a problem as there is a turnover of the presidency and new advisors and the future?
No, not the problem, not in the presidency. The problem that just looks, if you come into the Department of North America, Foreign Office or disarmament and so forth, and you try to talk with somebody on the issue of non-strategic nuclear weapon or on missile defense, and with whom to talk? The young boys and girls sitting, that's, you must educate them. And if to talk about the whole process of negotiation, because we, unfortunately, I could not bring this one, maybe the top specialist in arms control, who spent more than 2 decades negotiating with the United States. General Koltunov, he could not come. And, from his experience, I knew what it was a hard job to negotiate this. Mm-hmm. Even every word, every letter, every comma, started negotiating. And it takes, at some limited years, to reach such coordination, or just better to say common ground and understanding between, even in the language.
Okay. Well, let's ask Bridge to give us his thoughts. Bridge?
Okay. Thanks, Colonel Hughes, for that generous introduction, and thank you for your remarks. I'm going to give a little bit of the U.S. perspective and how I see the New START Treaty fitting into the broader picture based on my own experience and analysis. During the debates that swirled around the U.S. Senate's consideration of the New START Treaty, many argued that the treaty represented a sharp break with past U.S. policy. Ironically, those making this argument included both doves and hawks. Both camps pointed to President Obama's influential speech in Prague in the spring of 2009 and placed New START on a pathway towards very deep reductions and a fundamentally new approach on Washington's part towards nuclear weapons policy. Accompanied by some of the rhetorical flourishes in the Nuclear Posture Review released about a year later, this argument appeared to many to have substantial merit. But is this argument actually true? Did New START really represent a break with the traditional American approach to nuclear weapons policy? I believe that it did not. Quite to the contrary, I believe the New START represented a resuscitation, a reinvigoration of that traditional approach. Given the heated rhetoric that surrounded the Senate's consideration of the treaty, this seems counterintuitive. But when looked at in context, it becomes clearer to me that the treaty ended up strengthening rather than undermining the traditional U.S. policy of pursuing practical, modest arms control efforts while maintaining a firm and modern deterrent. Indeed, the story is, if anything, a perhaps quintessential illustration of how American government makes sharp breaks in policy difficult. Let me elaborate on this a little bit. U.S. nuclear weapons policy and the arsenal itself had received only episodic, focused attention since the end of the Cold War. The elder Bush administration had taken advantage of the end of the Cold War to cancel an array of strategic programs and make deep cuts in U.S. nuclear forces. The administration also concluded the original Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty with the dissolving Soviet Union in 1991. That treaty provided an architecture through which the two powers gained tremendously improved transparency into each other's forces, made stabilizing cuts in the huge strategic forces that each had built up, and demonstrated to the world a commitment to the cessation of the Cold War-era arms race. Following in the Bush administration's footsteps, the Clinton administration had adopted a lead but hedge policy in its 94 Nuclear Posture Review and pursued further arms control initiatives with Moscow, but focus generally began to shift away from strategic issues. Under the younger Bush administration, nuclear issues took a back seat as the administration focused on non-nuclear military capabilities and sought to move away from arms control as a tool of national policy. The upshot of this history was that by the end of the last decade, both the nuclear enterprise, by which I mean the personnel, weapons, complexes, and the like that constitute the U.S. strategic arsenal, and the arms control frameworks of which the United States was a part, were aging and in serious need of updating. This need was brought home by the accidental transport of nuclear weapons from Minot Air Force Base to Barksdale Air Force Base, by the inadvertent shipment of nuclear components or nuclear-related components to Taiwan, by growing reports of malaise in the U.S. nuclear community, and by the impending expiration of the START I treaty. The growing notoriety of the nuclear abolition movement, especially after its endorsement by the Four Horsemen in 2007, further contributed to the renewed interest in things nuclear. Rising to the need, a number of important commissions were chartered to look into how best to move forward. Congress itself chartered a Strategic Posture Commission, which I had the honor of serving as an advisor, along with Colonel Hughes, Bruce McDonald, and others here, to design a roadmap forward for the U.S. nuclear posture. The Congressional Commission included members from across the spectrum of views on nuclear weapons policy and was chaired by former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry and former Secretary of Defense Jim Schlesinger, and included a large number of advisors who've gone on to play important roles both in the administration and advising Congress. It thus represented an attempt, at least, to develop something like a consensus view in the defense policy community that could help guide Congress and the Obama administration on nuclear policy. In this respect, I think it succeeded. In effect, the Commission's recommendations represented an agreement of representative members from across the substantive spectrum on a way forward based on the traditional American dual approach of a strong deterrent and a vigorous arms control agenda. As the Commission itself put it, quote, "We have come together around a strategy that is firmly grounded in the strategic tradition of the United States in balancing deterrence and other means, including principally arms control and nonproliferation, to reduce nuclear dangers." Concretely, this meant that the Commission endorsed a package of maintaining the nuclear triad and investing in the nuclear weapons stockpile and complex, while pursuing arms control with Russia and taking vigorous action to uphold the nonproliferation regime. The Commission specifically endorsed pursuit of a follow-on agreement to the START I treaty. It was against this background that discussions began between Washington and Moscow on a replacement for the START I treaty, which was set to expire in December of 2009. Presidents Bush and Putin had agreed at the Sochi summit in April 2008 to develop a legally binding follow-on to START, and the Obama administration began exploring a follow-on in earnest in the spring of 2009. It is important to remember that this follow-on to START was never meant or expected to be a transformational agreement. Rather, the major focus was on extending and, where possible, strengthening the transparency and verification provisions of the original pact, while making some additional reductions in forces as well, as more broadly resuscitating the dormant arms control agenda. More broadly, both pragmatic and more ambitious supporters of arms control hoped that movement on replacing START would give life to the U.S.-Russian reset and would help in fostering cooperation with Moscow as well as more broadly on nonproliferation objectives. Advocates of more ambitious disarmament, including those within the new administration, hoped the New START would serve simply as a first step, but counted on further agreements to mandate more substantial reductions and more intrusive verification measures. Indeed, it was in large part because of the essentially incremental nature of these expectations that most people anticipated that a follow-on agreement would be signed by the parties and ratified in rather short order, an expectation that obviously proved to be unfounded. The treaty that did end up being signed in April of 2010, after over half a year of sometimes tough negotiations in Geneva and at several key intervals between the presidents and other top principals, basically met the objective of extending the START I framework. The new pact extended in modified form the inspection and data regimes of the previous treaty, which allow the parties to continue to gain important insights into the other strategic forces, albeit in a less intrusive and less comprehensive fashion than the original START agreement, which had been designed with Cold War tensions in mind. The new agreement also included limits on launch vehicles and warheads, but was not as focused on the classical issues of strategic stability as START I had been. Gone, for instance, were START I's penalties and START II's ban on MIRVed ICBMs, for instance. The new pact also required modest reductions in the parties' delivery systems and deployed warhead totals. These cuts were not drastic, however. The Russians already fell below the treaty's delivery vehicle limit. For the Americans, the rules were written in such a way that most of the reductions would be satisfied by converting systems such as the B-1B and some of the B-52H bomber force from nuclear to conventional-only roles, and by consolidating a roughly comparable number of warheads onto a lower number of Trident II submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Indeed, the administration made clear in its testimony to Congress that the limits set by the New START treaty were agreed to in light of the nuclear targeting guidance that had been set during the Bush administration, again indicating general continuity rather than sharp change. At the political level, the treaty also helped give some content and support to the reset in relations between Washington and Moscow, and may have been helpful in encouraging Russian assistance in dealing with the Iranian nuclear question. The treaty also helped both sides in nonproliferation efforts generally at the NPT review conference in the spring of 2010, as the two big nuclear powers could show concrete evidence of their commitment to meeting the requirements of Article 6 to cease the arms race. But the negotiations between the United States and Russia form only a part of the story of New START and its impact. For winning Senate advice and consent to ratification proved equally, if not more consequential for U.S. nuclear weapons policy, and thus for those countries affected by that policy. This is because the ratification process ended up addressing the other half of the Strategic Posture Commission's grand bargain, that is, the commitment to the repair and modernization of the U.S. nuclear weapons enterprise. Though there was initially a sense that ratification might be a fairly straightforward exercise, it became clear by the time the treaty was submitted for Senate consideration that there was serious skepticism about its utility and value among some members of the Senate. The ensuing 8 months saw a classic instance of legislative back and forth, as the administration negotiated with leading senators to craft what became, in effect, a package pathway forward for the U.S. nuclear posture. This was because the parameters of discussion about New START immediately moved beyond the pure confines of the treaty to encompass U.S. strategic posture as a whole, including the vitality of the nuclear enterprise, development and deployment programs for missile defense and conventional prompt global strike, extended deterrence policy, and Washington's understanding of the nature of strategic stability with Russia and other states. The basic effect of the nearly year-long process of gaining Senate advice and consent to ratification was, in my view, to develop such a way forward for the U.S. nuclear posture, one that greatly resembled the posture commissions. This package largely captured in the Senate's resolution of ratification, including giving advice and consent to ratification of the New START treaty, and thus to the principles of arms control as a valid tool of U.S. security. On the other side of the ledger, however, were firm and clear commitments by the administration, including the President himself and the Congress, to modernize the triad of delivery systems to a tune of over $100 billion, invest over $80 billion in a major recapitalization of the ailing nuclear weapons complex, and move forward with plans for the phased adaptive approach model of ballistic missile defense, as well as for conventional prompt global strike systems such as Boost Glide. This package represented a basic continuity with the traditional U.S. approach to strategic issues. In matching tailored and practical arms control efforts with the modernization of U.S. nuclear forces, it replicated, for instance, the Carter and Reagan administrations' marrying of INF and strategic force arms control offers with modernization of theater and long-range nuclear forces. Beyond this, the final package included a strong commitment to the triad of delivery systems and, as a practical matter, to the long-term health of the U.S. nuclear deterrent. The commitment to funding the replacement for the Ohio-class submarine, due to operate until the last quarter of this century, suggests there is no rush on the part of the United States as a government to embrace truly radical chimeras of abolition. Viewed in context, then, New START represents not just a continuation of past U.S. policy, but in a real sense a revivification of that policy. After years of relative neglect of the U.S. nuclear deterrent, the focus prompted by negotiation and consideration of the treaty ended up forging something like a new coalition, albeit a fragile one that must be tended to, willing to invest the resources and energy necessary to maintain the U.S. strategic force as second to none through most of the 21st century, with obvious implications for extended deterrence. What implications does this have going forward? How does it fit into our nuclear future, especially in East Asia? Primarily, it means that rhetorical flourishes aside, the United States is still basically and actively committed to the nuclear policy that it has embraced for over half a century. Indeed, this commitment has, if anything, been redoubled after a long stint of relative neglect. For allies, especially in more volatile regions like East Asia, this should be good news. Washington is committed to exploring ways to reduce and diffuse tensions, nuclear or otherwise, through practical arms control, but it is firmly committed to maintaining a peerless nuclear deterrent, one that is best shaped to provide not only attributes of survivability and effectiveness, but also various targeting options, deployment and operational flexibility, and political signaling value, all attributes that should contribute towards assuring U.S. allies such as South Korea and Japan. That said, there are many in Washington and elsewhere who are disappointed in New START and who want to see radical changes in U.S. policy and movement towards abolition. It is hard to see how this would happen practically, however. The administration's trade space with both Russia and with the Senate have been greatly diminished. Many of the tradable goods were spoken for in the New START negotiations and ratification deliberations. Indeed, the Russians have made clear that they are not particularly interested in a further round of reductions at this stage and are especially resistant to discussions about their theater nuclear forces, which the Senate and the administration have made a top priority for any subsequent arms control. Meanwhile, having committed to modernize the triad and invest in the weapons complex, the administration has a lot less to hold out to skeptical senators. An agreement with Russia that the Senate would agree to ratify is certainly possible, but it will take some creativity and good luck, and would have to involve commitments to strengthening the deterrent that would balance whatever obligations an arms control pact imposed. To finish, the bottom line is that the U.S. nuclear policy is back on track. New START is an important component of this approach, but it is only a part. Overall, the United States is now more actively committed to a policy of mitigating dangers through cooperation, while maintaining a nuclear posture that can continue to meet the obligations of deterrence and extend deterrence for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridge. That's a very good overview there. General Khan, would you care to comment on, as you would see it from a non-declared nuclear state, how arms control between two old opponents has set the stage for the future, perhaps for arms control in your region?
Thank you very much. As I was listening to previous two speakers, I was reminding, my last assignment in Pakistan was Director of Arms Control and Disarmament, and this was affairs. And this name particularly, I gave myself as director the name to this organization. And I wanted to share this experience with you because when this particular name came, and this is the time it happened before the India and Pakistan conducted the nuclear test. And this was the result of a lot of interaction that was made between Pakistan and United States on arms control issues. And as you defined arms control in your introductory remarks, I was reminded as to how this was introduced to the region. And when my setup was established, a famous professor on South Asia, Professor Stephen Cohen, he wrote in his book that, interesting, that the Pakistani armed forces have established a setup for arms control. It seems that they have begun to realize that arms control necessarily enhances security and does not reduce. The point you mentioned, that military's typical way of thinking is that anything that is controlled or reduced reduces security. And how come that these countries have begun to realize this? Immediately after the nuclear tests were conducted, U.S. diplomacy approached the region really very aggressively, with Strobe Talbot leading and Bob Inon, an expert from arms control, dealt with. And when they dealt with both India and Pakistan and actually almost goaded them to speak to each other and push into an arms control, that eventually resulted into an agreement that was made in Lahore in 1999. It was called the Lahore Memorandum of Understanding. But the language that was used and the experience that the American arms controller brought to the region in South Asia was a typical language that I just heard the previous two speakers talking about. And the first one from India's standpoint was India said, what kind of language is this? We don't understand this. This is not applicable to our situation. And that's where, from an outlier's perspective or from NPT's perspective, I like to share as to how the dynamics began to change, because the first point that, our speaker, actually you brought out the point, and I actually had my own point as well, that it should expand beyond the two countries and include all other countries to have a true meaning to that. So am I right? This is what you meant? So that you look at the total potential of that. Again, that reminds me that when India and Pakistan began to talk, and Pakistanis, we coined a term called strategic restraint regime. That was my desk did that same word. And actually, because we were slightly ahead in arms control terminology over India, India came back and said, well, we are actually a two-tier problem here. Nuclear weapons to us is a political weapon, means it's a status weapon. We're not going to even talk to you with Pakistanis. What are you talking about? We've got issues with China. And I heard just now when you mentioned that for Russia, they must calculate the total potential, using your words. This is exactly what the Indians were saying. We are looking at that. The Pakistanis turned back and told the Indians, well, if you are amassing weapons ostensibly for China, that's a little distant away, but we are just next door to you. We got to look at your total potential. And you see where it got. Nevertheless, a document that came out from the region in Lahore really is truly an arms control framework document with no experience in the region. Another point that struck me in this discussion was, and again it is relevant to the South Asia, was the point, Mr. Chair, you pushed about the experience, how this experience, does it translate or not? At the Naval Postgraduate School and the 10th anniversary of Indian Pakistani test, we conducted an exercise of bringing a project we call A Decade of Nuclear Learning. We brought people from the region explaining to the generation as to really what were the parameters on which we began to think about our nuclear test. What did we learn in 10 years? And recognize that it always takes a longer time for new nuclear powers to understand this thing. It's always a drag in the process. And actually, I've asked the DOE and NSA again to fund me so that we call it what is the next decade of nuclear learning, to sort of, translate all this experience. Otherwise, it's lost. And this is exactly the phenomena that we are losing a lot more new generations. My own exercise attempt is that, the United States actually did a great deal of service to India and Pakistan immediately after the nuclear test. But unfortunately, as soon as the US nuclear deal came with India in 2005, the idea and the language of arms control disappeared from the region. And that was actually a blow in the sense. And I noticed the third point that you mentioned, and you repeatedly mentioned in your presentation that, the practicality of arms control and the robustness of maintaining the deterrent at the same time is a classic balance, This is where the issues of the regional issues really get stuck up on. If you allow me, sir, I can give a few more comments, on the issue that it's not necessarily a Pakistani view, it's more or less a view of all the other countries. They're seeing the trend lines in the global, although they welcome the start, most of the countries that I interact with, many of the countries have had this very long-standing position that the best non-proliferation policy is disarmament. And I think India was the first country that was leading with this debate itself. But I think they are all seeing that no matter how you look at it, the legitimacy of nuclear weapons and the salience has not gone away, as your presentation was sort of bringing it away. They are seeing that, at least 20 to 30 countries today who are are non-nuclear weapon states can turn into nuclear weapon state in a matter of weeks or months. And this is how they see the world, we're the outliers country, they're not seeing the global arms control treaty going anywhere. CTBT is unlikely. FMCT is in limbo. Outer space, militarization of the outer space, and all sorts of technical innovations. There has been less salience on, there's some erosion on negative security assurance and all these issues. When we're looking at all this, these are the things that the other countries are more looking into. Two more points that I'd like to make is one about the notion of strategic stability and how the big powers see the strategic stability and how the smaller countries sort of emulate here. And again, I'll repeat that India-Pakistani dynamic is very regional security dynamic, very intense, very localized. India-China is a much more distant one, not as intense, but actually is more geopolitical in sense. But see how three particular points that you brought out in your presentation, and I'll relate to that, how it affects the region, you know. The challenges to strategic stability is about high precision conventional weapons and MIRVs, as you mentioned. Well, that actually pinches right under the survivability and the question of invulnerability, which is so important at the regional level, as much as it is the global level that hits. Now, much more between India and Pakistan, where the Pakistanis are nervous about this issue. To a lesser extent, India and China, because MIRVs is not with India, but at least Indians are viewing it from China. You can see how the triangular situation puts this particular issue in that regional context. The next issue is about the failure of transparency of nuclear complex. I think we talked about verifiability and transparency. This is one issue that every country has still nuclear weapons policy and it shrouded in secrecy. Somehow that culture has not changed. And ballistic missile defense, from a regional perspective, shifts the offense-defense balance. Whether or not China and India is affected or not, clearly this will be an effect between India and Pakistan, clearly, you know. The last issue I'll discuss, I don't want to go too much. You mentioned about the extended deterrence, you know, and for the last 2 days I'm hearing absence of nuclear weapons, how much anxiety is in these countries who are under the nuclear umbrella here. That's a question, you know, which also then again gives credence to the, is there any other way, political or conventional means to reassure conflict resolution perhaps? But the most important at the core I mentioned about the strategic restraint regime was, how do you address the conventional imbalance? US-Russia, Europe-Russia, US-China. What will be the future of conventional balance in West Pacific Asian? We sit here. Anybody who loses this conventional balance will sort of rely on nuclear weapons. Well, go down more closely into the regional context. The debate inside Pakistanis, I keep going and attending seminar, they're saying, well, back then it was NATO that thought that tactical nuclear weapons is, an equalizer to offset the Warsaw Pact's, convention superiority via Fulda Gap. Well, now it's the other way around, that the Russians are now seeing that the salience and all tactical nuclear weapons is contingent upon what will happen to them. Now, in a regional context, in India and Pakistan in particular, there are no tactical weapons. Or actually, conceptually, there are no tactical weapons. You can say distinguish between battlefield weapons. Every nuclear weapon is a strategic weapon, because the consequences are strategic in nature. And therefore, this is where the whole issue of how the nuclear weapons began in the thinking, you know. India's defeat by China pushed India into Pakistan defeat over India, pushed Pakistan into that, and to an extent even Israel looked. So offsetting conventional balance where salience of nuclear weapon plays somehow in the mind of all the three countries that are existing there. And finally, the word about transparency, at least at the regional level, this word transparency is a lexicon problem as much as it is a problem of understanding concept, you know. And my understanding is, because I also interact at China, India, Pakistan level, I don't see the Chinese truly understand the true meaning of what transparency means. I think there's a translation problem. And Indian Pakistanis are not reached that level. They think it's a very Western concept. So they're not quite close to them because they believe transparency threatens survivability. And that's the notion where they are not necessarily learning these issues. So I think these are the perspective from a very third world perspective. I hope I can do justice to this.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Brigadier. Before we open it up to questions, I would just summarize that some of the main issues that we have are the lack of experience, at least from the Russian perspective, of how you do arms control, and from the U.S. perspective, the importance of domestic concerns and how that can impact not just the ratification process, but the implementation of it. And then from the third world perspective, the conventional imbalance one, which all three pose particular challenges to the future of arms control and eventually to the hopeful goal of global zero. So with those thoughts in mind, let's open the floor up to questions. Right up here, Bruce.
Bruce McDonald with the United States Institute of Peace. It's not exactly news that missile defense is an important stumbling block in any kind of new agreement, and it is a testament really to the negotiating skills of both sides that we were able to reach the agreement that we did without taking that issue on head on. I wanted to ask Mr. Ryabkin if you could conjecture, Russia has said it wants to see limitations on missile defense. I've heard some suggestions that a possible restriction that Russia could live with would be one not unlike what was contained in and I'm outside of the United States, so I guess I can say the A word, the ABM treaty, of like maybe 100 or even the original 200 interceptors. Russia says it wants missile defense limited. Could you begin to shape for us what kind of a limitation Russia would be looking for in a follow-on successor agreement?
It's my guess that internally in Russia, you cannot find the answer, because this is for me. I think it's because I'm also trying just to ask my colleagues, even not colleagues, it's better to say the new generation who are now in general staff or in foreign ministry. What do you want? Of course, our old generation, we prefer something like ABM treaty. We understand that it's impossible to come back, but the best way may be something like this. And the number, you know the number. Now it's very flexible because the number of interceptors, the problem, the interceptor compare with command and control infrastructure. For example, one phase array radar that cost $1 billion, and one interceptor a few $1 million. So why we are just very worried about 10 interceptors in Poland? Because we know that from 10 to 100, it's very short way and very easy way. To build up the numbers, it's, today you agree just to limit, then you are just refuse to follow this agreement, for example, like U.S. made with ABM treaty, and during the year, you will have 100 interceptors. We're not worried about the numbers. That's why it's very difficult. It's my feeling that we don't know what number will really, we know, we can calculate which number, but just to fix this, it may be a wrong way. Just the principles might be the same. And I understand the colleagues in the United States, well, when talking with them, just what you want. And I know that it's the Russians cannot just only simply, we must have some guarantees. Which guarantees? Just simply saying, we must continue to talk in more details about this. That's some first, this interpretation and definition, because there's one very important thing. When we're talking about ABM cooperation, you mean that it's early warning and we call it firing complexes. I mean, but we, in our system, early warning, it's quite different from ABM itself. It's just the part of the work assignment of the early warning is for the ABM. That's why we suggested to cooperate, to start cooperate from the information exchange early warning system and others. But not for the. But our colleagues in the United States just immediately started. We just need urgently to intercept the Iranian or Saudi Arabian or other North Korean missiles with warheads. Just make it immediately, and that's why we just in such misunderstanding now, because the United States decided that Russia is ready to cooperate and fully cooperate, but we are just only stipulated that we would like to consider this cooperation. So still, it's badly coordinated in time. I think it's like this. So the number of the question, it's again details. You know that we must first to find common ground on approach, strategic approach, because the general said very exactly that the balance, strategic balance, that between offense and defense forces, this is one equilibrium. But unfortunately, I looked at my colleagues in the United States, that some American military planners are just thinking that it's quite different. No. Everybody understands that it's even in previous nuclear posture review that was one strategic potential. ABM was was named a part of the strategic triad. Mm-hmm. Now I'm talking with my friends and the generals. Say no, that's defense is defense. It was 30 years ago or 40 years ago when Russia, Soviet Prime Minister said, the ABM is defense. It's not a matter of arms control. Now you're in the same position. We're always on the same position, but in different time.
Okay, do I have another question? Right back there, please.
Thank you. Well,
can you please identify yourself?
Excuse me. My name is Hans-Joachim Schmidt. I'm coming from the Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt in Germany. Well, from my point of the perspective, I would say when I look to the future and see that Russia is forced first to reduce the strength of the nuclear forces and later on plan to increase the numbers to meet the limits of the new treaty. And when I look to United States, which face a deep budget deficit, and I know that Obama was willing to go even lower with the ceilings. From my point of view, it would be worthwhile to go further down on the strategic level. And from my point of view, it will not create too much difficulties in spite of the fact that then the United States must decide on the strategic triad. The problem which is tackling me is that it is now interconnected with European security, just mentioned missile defense issue. And in principle, we have the solution on the procedure. That is, we should do it by military cooperation. But we have no agreement on the details and the reassurance of the Russian side. So my question in particular to Mr. Kolbe would be, what do you think about that problem, and what is your perspective on that problem? Do you see a possible solution? Because we are losing time. In the end of the next year, we will have elections in Russia and in your country, and now we have an opportunity perhaps to solve that problem. And in saying that, I think for the Europeans, it's very important that conventional and nuclear arms control on the regional level is going on. But the Russians at present are not willing, because first they want to see how the missile defense issue is solved by military cooperation. And this is the link between these things. And you also want the linkage, because Congress has decided in future negotiations, the sub-strategic or the non-strategic nuclear weapons should be a part of the negotiations. So, and we have the asymmetries which were mentioned by you and by others here. Thank you.
Just to clarify, you're talking, thank you for your question, you're talking about the problem being the missile defense issue in particular, or the general future of arms control?
Well, the missile defense issue in particular, it has also to do in general with arms control.
Okay.
I would say, because there are a lot of other issues which are connected with that, especially from the Russian point of view, as far as you know.
I think as a practical matter, the chances of having some kind of legally binding treaty constraining U.S. missile defense development is implausible, very low, and won't be solved. And the increased heat of the rhetoric coming out of Moscow in the last few months about that indicates or confirms that there's a very wide gap. The reality of the situation gives me a little more confidence that this will not be too fundamental of a roadblock to progress in perhaps a more informal way, or in developing or perpetuating the structure that New START extended from STAR 1, which is to say that U.S. missile defense programs as a technical matter are not oriented towards Russian systems and do not have the technical capability to do so. And I was asked, I was giving a talk about a year ago when the New START ratification deliberations were happening. A Russian diplomat asked me, what is going on with missile defense? How can we handle the situation? I said, well, if the country is spending $9 billion a year on the missile defense program, this is not the order of magnitude expenditure of a country that is seeking to undermine the fundamental deterrent of Russia. And so there is a perceptual problem and an issue of intentions and a potential for a radical technological breakthrough. There's only so much that the American side can do to allay Russian concerns. If the Russians look at the budget, if they look at the technological development, if they look at the posturing of missile defense forces, and if they look at the stated purposes of these systems, which, as Secretary Gates pointed out, has been relatively consistent since the Bush 1 administration, Bush 41 that is, they should be allayed, and that should not be too difficult of a roadblock. I'm not sure that's actually going to happen. As I think I made clear in my talk, I'm pretty skeptical about significant steps in arms control going forward. However, I don't think that the difficulties of making significant or radical steps forward should block more modest but practically useful advances.
A follow-on question to that point, if I might. Our previous questioner mentioned that future cuts at the strategic level would be necessary or would be desirable. And that brings up the issue of the concern of breakout, that if the U.S. and Russia took themselves down to 1,000 or even lower, does that encourage a breakout? And how would you envision that being prevented or controlled? And Leonid, let's start with you, and then let's get Bridges' thoughts on that.
As I remember, the time when the Old Start 2 and the Old Start 3 discussion, that our team of experts from our committee, mostly that retired military, we even proposed the number, about few hundred, 700, and we decided that it was enough. 500, and even 200, because our position was how much we need for the deterrence. It depends how many warheads acceptable for the United States to be delivered. Then we found that after the McNamara, that United States don't want any one warhead to be delivered to the United States. So it's very easy to calculate what it will be the number for minimum deterrence. It means that nuclear arsenals from the other countries will be very comparative with what Russia and the United States can reach in agreement. Very low numbers, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's the mechanism is very simple. We need the other countries to be involved in this. But even just to maintain this road or way to the nuclear-free world, in any numbers which we have now, or it's not a problem how many we have, it's a problem how to eliminate it. But the other nuclear countries, because they're following the wrong way, which we two countries started many decades ago. So we made nuclear weapons, now we don't know what to do with nuclear weapons. So we must reduce the value of military value of nuclear weapons. And that means that the other country, it's not depend how many they want, even one or two. Mm-hmm. Because the rational what that we have this.
Okay.
And I think that we need them to be the part of the process.
Okay, Bridge, and we're going to get the hook soon, so as soon as you're through, General, if you'd like to offer your closing comments.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I have a slightly different view. I think that the dangers of breakout are affected by the nature of the two sides' forces, obviously. To the extent that both the Americans and the Russians have moved to more survivable forces and a diversified set of capabilities, particularly on the American side, that is to the good. So it's chiefly a launcher issue. That said, from a kind of crisis stability point of view, we need to have sufficient forces on day-to-day alert to be able to deliver that number of weapons reliably to targets, have them penetrate the defenses and effectively destroy the target to satisfy our understanding of what the requirement is. And that requirement is, not an insignificant number. But when you factor in the effectiveness and the penetration, these sorts of issues, it becomes higher. I don't agree that we should be making a further step on strategic arms reductions absent some kind of countervailing benefit that would justify those reductions. I think my personal view is that our pursuit should be of an equilibrium point in the forces between, or a stability point in the relationship between the United States and Russia and others, and that can happen that might actually happen at a higher level of forces. So I would not be in favor of reductions for their own sake. I'm certainly open to them if there's a good reason, but since I don't think abolition is a desirable objective, I don't support it for its own sake.
Thank you. In general, your closing thoughts?
Well, I don't have much thoughts to say, but whatever number the two superpowers fix, my suggestion would be that the other three powers could be half of that number, and the other three could be half of that number. Now, one study that I remember, I think, was that if all told weapons are at 500, today the other three powers, China, France, and England, they are roughly about 250. And if you talk Israel, India, and Pakistan, they are plus minus about 125 or so, 120. They will be there in a couple of years there. Freeze it, have a new new deal altogether with all the countries and have a nuclear weapon convention, and we move on.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our panel for today. I want to thank all of you for attending, and if you didn't get your question in tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, under Leonid's tutelage.
Everybody's just
Let-
we
let's
have a
give-
lot of to talk, so please welcome tomorrow if we can wake up.
Let's give our panel a round of applause.
We will now have a quick coffee break. There will no longer be any sessions held in this room today or tomorrow.